Paul writes to the believers in Rome, a congregation he had not yet visited but longed to instruct in the fullness of the gospel. By the 5th chapter of his letter, he has already established that both Jew and Gentile stand condemned under sin, and that righteousness comes not through the law, but through faith. Having shown that Abraham was justified by trust in God's promise, Paul now turns to a comparison between two men whose actions determined the condition of all humanity, Adam and Christ. The surrounding verses speak of sin entering the world through one man, of death spreading to all, because all sinned, and of grace abounding much more than the trespass. This is the immediate frame in which the closing verse of the comparison stands. The verse reads, "For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous." Socinus approached this verse with careful attention to its grammar and its plain historical claim. The passage sets two men side by side, Adam and Christ, and attributes to each an action, disobedience on the one hand, obedience on the other. Notice that Paul does not say Christ's deity, nor Christ's eternal generation, nor Christ's co-essential nature with the Father made many righteous. He says obedience. This is a moral and historical category, not a metaphysical one. Obedience belongs properly to a will that submits to another, to a servant who follows a command given to him. Christ is here presented as the one who obeyed, and it is precisely this obedience, exercised in his human life and consummated on the cross, that becomes the ground of righteousness for others. Socinus reasoned that if Christ were himself the supreme and independent God, obedience in this sense would be a strange category to apply to him, for the highest God does not obey another will above himself. He simply wills. Obedience presupposes a superior whose command is followed, and Paul's whole argument rests on Christ fulfilling that role as a man standing in relation to God his Father. The parallel with Adam sharpens this point further. Adam was a created man, and his disobedience is described without any hint of divine nature entering the account. If the comparison is to hold its rhetorical and theological force, the one who reverses Adam's failure must likewise be a man, acting in the same created sphere of obedience and disobedience. Paul makes this explicit earlier in the chapter when he calls Christ simply one man, and again in the 15th verse names him one man, Jesus Christ. The comparison is man to man, not God to man. This is precisely the pattern Socinus found running through Paul's letters. Christ as the new Adam, the commissioned representative of humanity whose perfect obedience undoes what the first Adam's rebellion introduced. 1 Corinthians 15 confirms this reading directly, where Paul writes that as by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead, and calls Christ the man through whom life comes to those united to him. The Trinitarian reading holds that Christ's obedience is the obedience of the divine Son who, without ceasing to be equal with the Father in essence, took on a human role for the sake of accomplishing redemption, so that the humility of obedience belongs to his human nature, while his divine nature remains unaffected and eternally sovereign. This view seeks to protect both Christ's full deity and honest reading of texts describing his submission. Yet the text itself gives no hint of two natures operating side by side. Paul does not qualify obedience as belonging to a human nature distinct from a divine person. He speaks of one man whose singular act of obedience stands opposite one man's singular act of disobedience. To introduce a hidden division between natures where the text presents a single undivided agent is to add a category the passage never raises. The concern for Christ's deity, however sincere, cannot be read into a verse whose entire force depends on straightforward human parallelism. Philippians 2 offers a companion witness to this same pattern. There Paul describes Christ as found in the form of a man, becoming obedient unto death and being exalted by God as a reward for that obedience. Reward implies a recipient who did not previously possess the glory bestowed, which fits a commissioned servant far better than an unchangeable, supreme deity who could gain nothing new. Socinus saw in these texts a consistent witness. God the Father remains the one supreme God, the source of all authority, while Jesus Christ, born of a woman under the law, walks the path of obedience as the appointed mediator, proving through his perfect submission and resurrection that God's promise of life is trustworthy. His obedience becomes the pattern believers are called to imitate, not merely a transaction accomplished apart from them. For Paul urges believers throughout Romans to walk in newness of life following the very shape of Christ's death and resurrection. Reading Romans 5:19 this way honors both the wording Paul chose and the structure of his argument. It preserves the strict unity of God the Father as the sole ultimate authority, while giving full weight to Christ's genuine humanity and his historical act of obedience as the ground of hope for many. The verse does not ask its readers to posit hidden natures or unstated metaphysical distinctions. It simply and powerfully sets one man's fall against one man's faithful obedience, inviting every reader to walk the same road Christ walked, trusting that the God who raised him will also raise those who follow him in sober, righteous, and devout living. In closing, I want to encourage you, examine for yourself, search diligently, read the scriptures with an open and rational mind. Socinianism does not rest on tradition or church authority, but on the conviction that God's truth is rational, clear, and morally sublime. If this perspective has resonated with you, and you wish to explore the biblical Unitarian view further, visit www.socinianismus.d for in-depth articles, studies, and reflections on central theological questions. If this video has been helpful, please support this work with a like. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss another contribution on the unity of God, the teaching of Jesus, and the rational interpretation of Scripture. Until the next video.